Hello, everyone. Welcome to DiEMTV, to the DiEMTV Goes Local program. I am Myriam Zekag, a French activist for DiEM25. For those who don't know it yet, DiEM25 is a pan-European political movement that seeks to defend the rights of citizens and enforce real democracy throughout Europe and throughout the world internationally. For today's program, we welcome Mrs. Minna Salami, writer and activist, so that she can present her latest book, Sensuous Knowledge, a Black feminist approach for everyone, that was published in March this year. Minna, it's great to have you with us.
Hi, Miriam. It's great to be here with DiEMTV and with you. Thank you for the invitation. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. So yeah, just one small note for our audience. This program is live so that you can ask questions. It will be streamed on Facebook and YouTube. So I don't know exactly where you're looking at it, but wherever you're looking at it, you can post your comments in the chat box or in the comments under the video. We will pick some of them for the Q&A session that will take place in the last 15 minutes of our 1-hour interview. So we look forward to your inputs. Okay, so let's get started. I want to start basically by trying to build a bridge between, well, the DiEM way of thinking and your thoughts, Minna. I'd like to ask you especially about the exploitative nature of the system that we live in at the moment, and how we can overcome it. This is exactly what DiEM seeks to do in all of its programs, all of its endeavors. So on the one hand, if you look at the general landscape, we have some green movements like Fridays for Future, like Extinction Rebellion, that are winning battles. Environmental issues have made it to the mainstream media. Even the European Commission has put forward a Green Deal. It's not new, but it's green. So that's progress. But on the other hand, we have right-wing movements like in Brazil or the US that are completely determined to undermine any efforts to address climate change, etc. So what DiEM is suggesting, what one could argue, is that our global capitalist system is the problem. And why is it the problem? Is because the environment does not have value in that system. It is to be exploited for consumption, for human beings, for maximizing the utility of consumers, basically, without much thought to a natural balance between human beings and the environment and other living beings. That's something that you challenge in your book, Minna, with the notion of sensuous knowledge, which reintroduces that balance between humanity and the rest of living beings and living creatures. So I would like you to tell us a little bit about this idea of sensuous knowledge, what it means, and how it can improve our relationship to the environment, to the world, to our community, to our peers everywhere, and how we can use it as activists to build a better world.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that question. And it's good to know that DiEMTV is doing similar work. You know, I think we're quite many people who are working toward changing not just the structures, but the actual ways that we think about the problems that the world faces. And, you know, all of the big challenges that we are facing at the moment, so inequality, climate change, biological threats to humanity, poverty, all of these issues, they do indeed share a root cause. And this root cause is it's a way of thinking, it's a worldview. And it's a worldview that is based in the ideas of fragmentation, of polarization, of hierarchy, you know, it's very limiting, basically. And it's a worldview that it's kind of set up in order to profit a very small group of people. And that makes it in itself and inherently exploitative. And so I refer to this worldview as Euro-patriarchal knowledge, because it is marked by the dominance of Eurocentricity and of patriarchy. And so in my book, my book is titled Sensuous Knowledge, and I get into the depths of Euro-patriarchal knowledge because in order to critique something, you have to deeply engage with it. And so I pry into it to really get to the root of where did Euro-patriarchal knowledge start, and I trace it back to the medieval times, basically, and when European monarchs started to send explorers out into the world, into parts of the world that were previously thought of as the unknown, and how that led to this kind of acquisitive, exploitative mindset. But more importantly than critiquing Euro-patriarchal knowledge, the point of engaging with it at depth in this way is to expose the holes in it, because it isn't a stable narrative. It's full of holes, even with it using its own methodologies of rational and logical thought. And the reason of exposing the holes is because the more that we are able to see the cracks and holes in our cultural education, the less we will value that education. And the less that we value the education, the less likely we are to uphold it, which is something that we do both consciously and unconsciously, you could say. My book is, however, it is a polemic and an epistemology at the same time. So it's both critiquing Euro-patriarchal knowledge, but I also offer a different worldview, you could say, a different paradigm and a different epistemic approach toward the challenges that we face. And this is what I refer to as sensuous knowledge. Bear in mind the difference between sensual and sensuous. So sensual means things that are to do with the senses and things that give us bodily, physical pleasure. Whereas sensuous is when something affects us wholly. So when something affects the mind and the body and the soul, you could say that it is sensuous. And so what I do then is to develop sensuous knowledge, is to kind of, we're always told that we can't, that there's a kind of wrong way to approach epistemology, which is knowledge production or the study of knowledge. And so we're always told to separate between the aesthetic and the mystical. Or on the other hand, you have like the political and the demystifying. And what I'm saying in sensuous knowledge is that no, we can't split these two, because they all inform knowledge. They all inform the ways that humanity thinks. And so if we're going to have a kind of transformative episteme, then we have to tie these together. But how do you do that? That becomes the next question. So what I would classify as kind of the aesthetic and the mystical is things like art, myth, poetry, embodiment, the non-human natural world, interiority, all of these, vast and very important parts of human life that get neglected or devalued in the Euro-patriarchal knowledge worldview. And then on the other hand, what I would classify as the political and the demystifying is, your feminist theory, critical analysis, science, rational thinking, basically. And so what I do is to bring these together. And so each chapter in my book is examining a universal concept that affects all of our lives. So things like power and knowledge, of course, and identity and race and womanhood and beauty. So universal concepts that impact all of our lives, but that women and indigenous communities and people of color and the non-human natural world have never really had a say in defining. And I look at these concepts with this prism of sensuous knowledge. So looking at the way that you do that is that, looking at a topic like power, for example, is that you consider that with using art and using myth and using imagination, and connecting even, spirituality, like theories from yoga and so on, right, and philosophy. But then you also look at the theories that have been built around a topic like power, for instance. And the reason that this is so important, and especially in our times when the issues that we're facing globally are so, they're so complex and so interconnected, it means that whatever kind of transformative education and paradigmatic pattern of knowledge that we want to use, it has to be a reflection of that in itself. And so in order to approach a kind of genuine and holistic transformation, it is important to really look at the world, look at the issues, look at the, I use these particular concepts as obviously like a very much wider range, but to look at them in this kind of holistic approach so that the empowerment and the transformation is both internal and external.
I thank you very much for this reply, and I'm especially puzzled by the concept of Euro-patriarchy because it seems to me very spot on, and at the same time I want to deconstruct it to understand exactly how you load this term. Especially that, well, the notion of sensuous knowledge seems to me completely in the lineage of people like Edward Said or Wole Soyinka. Please forgive my my pronunciation, but these are two bright minds that really used arts and that really did use this creativity, all aspects of humanity, to establish a kind of diagnostic of how we see one another. And each one of them actually, like Edward Said saw, each one of them identified Europe at the center. In the narrative in general, it is at the center. And this is completely tied to this notion of Euro-patriarchy. It does see itself in the center, and the rest is the other. I'm not even going to touch upon women as the other of the men, because this is completely on topic, but could you please unpack this notion of Euro-patriarchy for us, and talk to us a little bit about this otherness, and even to go a little beyond that, I kind of want to reverse the roles and change a little bit the perspective. Let's do an intellectual exercise and see what would it look like, what does it look like actually when the other is looking at Europe. Could you please talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting that you make a comparison with Edward Said's Orientalism, I assume, but also his larger body of work, and Wole Soyinka, who is first and foremost a novelist. I mean, definitely a polemicist as well, but he tells stories. But I think what is absolutely a connecting point, and so you're right to make this parallels, is the kind of focus on the narrative, and on who is at the center of the narrative. So the thing that Euro-patriarchy, or to be more specific, throughout the book I refer to it as Euro-patriarchal knowledge, because what I am doing in sensuous knowledge in the book is basically looking at the narrative behind the structures. So we have many theories that are brilliant about white supremacy. Bell Hooks, the Black feminist theorist, she refers to it as like the white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist system, for instance. And so we have theories that are looking at the structures that this system has created, which we are now facing so many repercussions from. What I'm trying to do is kind of looking at the meta system, or the meta narrative. So what is the story that creates the system? Because basically, in order to recreate the system, we have to reimagine the story. And this is something that I think Edward Said and Wole Soyinka are examples of people who who have done that in very profound ways, which is why we continue to reference their work. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, it goes back to what I was saying about exposing the holes, because when you start to look at these narratives, because they are so full of holes, it's kind of like, it's clarity, basically. It's almost like, you know, a worldview. You could compare it to a window view. So let's say you're in a building, and there's two windows, and one has a green lens and diamond-shaped patterns, and then you have another window with a pink lens and circular-shaped patterns. When you look outside of those windows, you're going to see different things. And so when the holes in Euro-patriarchal knowledge have been exposed, and you look out of that window, you no longer believe what you see. And what that does is that it kind of makes you the subject. It's an almost automatic process, which is why it's so important to end the delusion and the deception in this narrative. Because, you know, we tend to think that we need to reconstruct or remove things or add things, and we sort of complicate the process of awakening, you could say. But really what we need to do is to show how something is flawed, to show that something is a lie, to expose it. And once you do that, this automatic, the fact that you no longer believe in something, it automatically makes you the subject, in a sense. And so once you now are the subject, that is when everything that you have learned and the ways in which the world is presented to you just becomes a malleable thing. You start to question, you start to want to really probe into it and reinvent. And so this mirror play that you mentioned, looking at Europe from the African perspective, is something that is so important to do, but really it's it's something that happens after you have seen and been and the lies have been exposed to you. It happens quite automatically. And at that point, I mean, just to make it more concrete and give some practical examples, you know, we have these stories about the transatlantic slave trade, the very invention of Africa through to colonization and neo-colonialism that we now live in. And in these histories, there's always the other, as you mentioned, the word the other is always present. And when you remove that lens of the other, when you start to look from the window that is sort of labeled African, what you might see, for example, is how do I say this? So when you think of the colonization process, which is something that is still ongoing, by the way, but it wasn't, you know, it's not this clear-cut thing that European monarchs and explorers came and then they colonized Africa out of greed. There was an interplay, there was resistance. Every ethnic group in Africa pretty much resisted this process. But there were so many, the societies and the kingdoms in which people lived were predominantly city-states. And they were relatively small. And these city-states had a kind of healthy rivalry with each other. So they weren't, most of the time, they weren't in any kind of outright warfare. But they had a healthy rivalry and they traded with one another. And so when you had these Europeans who came in, the city-states, so these could be like the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Hausa, and this is in what is today known as Nigeria, it was very difficult for them to resist in this kind of collective manner. And we aren't able to see this when we are dealing with Euro-patriarchal knowledge, because it sets up these fragmentations and polarizations, as I mentioned earlier. So we stay focused in being against the narrative of Euro-patriarchal history, rather than really trying to understand what was happening with our own ancestors. Why were their resistance efforts, why weren't they able to successfully resist European dominance? And so this is just one example of when you become subject, it just changes the way that you look at history in itself.
What you mentioned about power, it's a question that I want to touch on a little later. But I mean, this reversal of perspective, yeah, it's so interesting. And beyond those societal relationships, beyond this historical lineage in which we all have to insert ourselves, there are, I don't know, just in my reading of history in the Muslim world, in the African countries, empires, and so on, there are stories of where, you know, the power relationships within the societies that will make and break those alliances. I'm thinking, for example, of the Crusades. There's a fascinating book about from Amin Malouf, the Crusades seen by the Arabs, again, in this change of perspective. And he shows how the insertion of Europe was instrumentalized to shift power relations in the country to the detriment of this and that city-state. It was basically just using those foreign powers for internal power play. But at the root of that, what I see in history and even today, what I see is really the fact that there is inequality. There is an inequality, a system of inequality. There is a culture of inequality from which some, well, benefits and some don't. In the use of power, it is perpetuated. Sadly, I would like to say, even people who want to save the world, forgive my naive phrasing, are not immune to that. DiEMTV is not immune to that. Progressive movements are not immune to that. We do see patterns of dominance over women, over differences in gender, in status, and so on. Is there any way out of this culture of inequality? Is there any way out? Is there any way we can fight this culture from within? And because you mentioned Euro-patriarchal knowledge, is there any way to move away from this Euro-patriarchal knowledge? What concrete steps do we need to take to move past this culture of inequality and to move past this Euro-patriarchal way of thinking that just perpetuates those inequalities?
Easy question. You know, I think there is a way, and that's basically what my book and my work is proposing. And it is slightly, you could accuse anyone who thinks that there is a way out of Euro-patriarchal knowledge for being utopian. But it is important that we continue to imagine new worlds, because that's how change has always happened. But it's not going to be an easy process. It hasn't been thus far. This isn't something new. You know, we have been, people have been trying to change and transform society for decades and centuries, even within Euro-patriarchal knowledge, you know, because one thing to say is that Euro-patriarchal knowledge is not synonymous with Europeans or with white men or anything like that. Even though these are the groups who will tend to have blind spots because they are privileged by this knowledge system. But, you know, even within this system itself, there have always been critiques. But I think we are potentially at a bit of a threshold right now where the work that has been done for so long can come into fruition. And this is because of, you know, I mean, even if you look at the very specific situations that have happened in the world in 2020, like with the coronavirus pandemic, think, for example, of how we are using technology in such positive ways compared to just a few months ago. So, you know, we can talk a lot about interconnectedness, and even people who create a lot of platforms, you know, the Zooms and the Skypes and the WhatsApps, they talk about connecting people, right? But for so long, and I'm not saying that this isn't still the case, but really these are profit-making ventures. But what the coronavirus has done, for instance, is it's kind of making us use these technologies in a positive way, in the way that you would think that we would create them for. You know, like we should be creating technology for the purposes of being able to gather together and think together and just be together in the way that you know, this conversation is happening right now with people from all over the world joining in, and so this means that we're on a kind of threshold where we're being exposed to the what could be, and that is it's going to be a slow process, but it kind of plants a seed within individuals who are either, you know, truth seekers or people who are just fed up with the system, and this is where an idea like sensuous knowledge comes in, because once that seed of consciousness has been planted within you, and by you I mean the individual as well as the collective. So actually, the reason that I wrote sensuous knowledge, I mean, perhaps the largest motivation was, you know, I've been speaking, I've been writing about these topics, about feminism, about Pan-Africanism and Black liberation for over a decade now, and in different countries, at different kinds of platforms, from universities to grassroots to, you know, huge global events. And this also addresses your question or your point about what goes on within activist movements, even within DiEM, is, you know, what I noticed in all of these spaces is that despite all of our efforts and our desire and our fed upness and really trying to effect change, so little was ultimately taking place. So little change was taking place. And a lot of the change was just kind of surface levels, like plastering over wounds, but not really allowing them to heal. And so sensuous knowledge really came from the realization that we need a new language if we're going to eventually really get to grips with you know, we're challenging the Euro-patriarchal knowledge, because that is it's a kind of a language, it's a worldview. And so in terms of, you know, how does that change actually happen? How can we do that? What sensuous knowledge is proposing is a kind of, you could almost call it unifying knowledge. And so whatever issue it is that we're looking at, be it you know, sexism within a specific institution, or even in our personal lives with the people we're interacting with, be it, you know, the different kinds of structures that feed into poverty, this question of power and how power is defined. When you apply sensuous knowledge to these issues, what you're doing is you're bringing in and you're interweaving and bringing in a kind of holistic approach to it. And so we have to understand something like power in multiple ways. You know, we can't just say, oh, we're going to put in more women in top positions in an organization, for instance, without looking at the kind of language that exists in the company strategy and so on and so forth. So it's always bringing in this kind of holistic approach, and also thinking, how can we do this beyond conversation? Like, can we commission art? Can we, I mean, this might sound a bit sort of hippie or something, but, you know, can we just gather in a circle and talk or meditate or something? And really, these are strategies that we're going to have to employ more and more, because again, looking at the situation of the world today, you know, the kind of effect that something like the coronavirus has, apart from the real, you know, all of the suffering that it is creating. There's also these mental health dimensions, and we are emerging out of this crisis now. There's been, you know, the huge global protests, which are very much against racism, but also classism, I think, you know, and that's something that we don't speak about sufficiently. And all of these things combined means that there's really there's a deep trauma. And if we don't address that in some kind of way in all of these conversations, then it's going to manifest in ways that will incapacitate the other transformatory work that needs to be done.
I want to bounce back on the notion of power that you mentioned. Actually, before I do, I want to address the audience one very quick second. If you do have questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the comments. There have been a few already, so we've taken notes, and it'll be good to have, you know, a direct answer to your interrogations. So, yeah, I want to bounce back on the notion of power that you mentioned. There's one thing that I want to share, well, my experience and the experience of other activists in DiEM of this COVID-19 crisis. We are, by essence, a transnational movement, and this means that we do work a lot online, but we do realize this is part of our strategy. This was part of our strategy from day one. This sense of togetherness is crucial to taking power, you know, to feel empowered, to making sure that you have agency, you are able to impact power relations in your locality, in your neighborhood, and so on. What we've seen during the COVID-19 crisis is, yeah, there were a couple of organizers that managed to organize their streets, and people were longing for this togetherness. They were longing for being assembled, and yeah, I do think that you're right on many topics, because one thing that I want to dig a little bit into is, yeah, this notion of power, especially. It's an ambiguous one, because on the one hand, we resent power, you know, when it's enforced upon us, and we don't like people who do have power, and it's a negatively connoted term. But then on the other hand, the other side of the coin is empowerment. Well, it's the process of gaining power, of, you know, gaining this kind of agency, but it is much more positively connoted, and it is really used towards change, to imagine and to create the conditions necessary for the sustained change that we need to bring about in this holistic fashion that you described. So I kind of want to ask you how you manage to reconcile those two views. Is this to you an ambiguous notion at all, or is it very clear? And I kind of want to touch upon also on groups that feel disempowered more often than not. How can we use this kind of, well, this notion? How can we see the world seize power at our level to empower ourselves, empower our peers, empower others, our community, and, you know, make that move forwards?
Thank you. Yes, power is. I think Martin Luther King said something along the lines of, you know, power without love becomes abusive and overpowering and dominant and authoritative in dangerous ways, which is what we see a lot of in the world. And he also said that that on the flip side, that love without power can become too I don't want to use the word soft, and that's not what he used. I'm paraphrasing entirely, obviously. But basically why I'm thinking about this is because it is important that power is connected to love. I just want to put that out there to start with. Now, in the Euro-patriarchal knowledge education that we have received and that dominates our world, power is pretty much synonymous with dominance, with control, manipulation, violence, authority. This is how we think. So you're very right when you say that we tend to think of power as almost as a negative term. And so even though it is something we also then want, what we end up seeing is that people who step into power, who have power, because of the way that the power is defined, they have a tendency to become dominant and controlling and violent and manipulative. And so it is clear that the way that we define power is antecedent to the way that we structure power. And so it is also clear that if we want to have a different structure of power, then we need to reimagine what we mean by power in the first place. And one of the big concerns and sort of conundrums to me when I think about power is that despite that it is such a central concept for activists, be it for women, for indigenous rights activists, for environmentalists, for people of color all around the world in the global south, there are so few reconceptualizations of power. And so we sort of are, we're resisting power, we're challenging power structures day in, day out, tirelessly. But we're doing it with the same old language because there are so few reconceptualizations of it. And so in my book, I do offer a reconceptualization, which I have developed in a series of essays on a platform called whatisemerging.com. And I refer to this conceptualization of power as exousians. This comes from the Greek word exousia, which means power. And basically, what exousians is about, it's looking at power, first of all, as a phenomenon. So I wanted to really understand, like, what is power when we remove it from all of these Euro-patriarchal definitions? What is it, first of all, how does it manifest in the universe? And then after doing that, what I realized, perhaps more than anything, is that power is a kind of, is an immanent, but it's also a reciprocal force. So it's something that is very relational. And once we begin to redefine power in this way, I mean, this theory is relatively, or it's highly complex, actually. So I can't describe it in detail right now. That would take too long. But I basically have this, the method of exousians is something that I call branching, and it's based upon conversations really that I had with the non-human natural world, and I discovered that there's this kind of branching pattern that's immanent in everything, in trees, in rivers, in human capillaries, in thunder. So it's this kind of fractal-like dendritic pattern. And building upon that, when you see that power is this sort of life-giving, reciprocal, interrelational phenomenon, then you start to, you can start to reimagine and restructure social institutions, be they the political or the personal. And you also can see then that, you can see the process, because one thing that is very important when it comes to this whole restructuring of power and reimagining of power is understanding that it is a process. It's not a Euro-patriarchal knowledge with its sort of machine-like, mechanistic, fragmenting, hierarchical thought patterns. It's always a dead end with this kind of thinking. Whereas with exousians and with sensuous knowledge, everything is a process. And so you can kind of apply change to one element, and then you see how it transforms the whole, and vice versa. And yeah, I'm trying to think if I've addressed your question fully, but as you can glean, what this really is speaking to is it's how, you know, the change that we need to see in the world is very much the growing connection between the inner and the outer. And again, you know, this applies both individually and collectively. And what we've been doing for so long is just approaching the outer. But what I'm getting at is how do we combine the two? And so that is where, you know, this matter of empowerment. Empowerment means literally a kind of inner process of coming to power. So the prefix refers to something internal, and ment at the end is the, you know, it's the intellect, mentality. So empowerment is, per definition, something that is an inner process that then manifests in the outer.
Thank you very much. On this notion of story and narrative, I'm touching upon the last question that I had for you before touching on the very interesting questions that we've had in the comments. Thank you very much, viewers. Is this notion of how you build a story that that can empower people, really, that can bring the power back to where it's supposed to be. Well, at least increase the flow, and not leave anyone out of it, which has been the case in this exploitative system, as we've seen with the terrible events, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Adama Traoré, and many others. And that's what is so sad. It's just, against this, there has been a resurgence of a new narrative that is, like, you know, trying to to address the colonial past. We saw the statues being destroyed. We saw demands for reparations. We see we see a sort of unity being brought up to the fore in many countries that have had this discrepancy in the narrative. And I find this absolutely fascinating. So, because to me, this puts the seed of a new narrative that puts this colonial story at peace, that does give ownership to every single person that has been touched by this story, and with the hope, in my view, of building a new notion of multiculturalism. Beyond that, of just living together, just cohesion in general, in whatever society you want to define. So the link, how you build a story to create this kind of cohesion, how we move past this colonial story as it was told for centuries, and how we build a new notion of living together. How? And I know I'm asking you tough questions, but I'm ambitious and you have answers to everything. So I will ask this question, but how can we apply this new way of thinking? How can we use this opportunity to build a new narrative to complete the process of decolonization, to heal our societies, to move towards healing and not towards more violence and conflict in this old framework that we have? And how can we use that to create a new way to think about multiculturalism? Maybe we need to move away from the word altogether, but how can we imagine this new way of living together is the question I want to ask you.
Yeah, first of all, you know, your questions are great, and I really enjoy big questions like this. That's what my book is about, and that is, I guess you could say, what I'm encouraging all of us to do. You know, to become more curious and to think big, and to one of the wishes I have with sensuous knowledge is that it shows that, you know, that the world is more expansive than we generally think, because Euro-patriarchal knowledge has taught us to limit ourselves, to see things through this very narrow prism that we don't even realize. It's going back to the window analogy. It's cut out a tiny window in a huge, if the building is the world, it's like a castle, but it gives us this tiny window to look through. And sensuous knowledge is trying to carve out a huge window, the size of the castle, so we can see it all. And so, yes, the question of narrative is always central, and the point of that being central is to heal. So if we go back to what we spoke about earlier with this dichotomy and binary, which is so central to Euro-patriarchal knowledge, between you can say this in very many ways. So it's between emotional intelligence and rational thinking. It's between arts and science. It's between what I said was like the aesthetic and the mystical, and the political and the demystified. It's between art and theory. Everywhere there's just this dichotomy. And so what we are taught as citizens, as individuals and groups, is that we need to think in this way. And so if you are somebody who is working within something that is considered to be scientific, then you're not supposed to think about anything holistic or artistic, and vice versa. And so whatever we are grappling with here, again, I can't stress this enough. It's about bringing a unifying approach, but also it is about taking the right to ask the question. You have the right to ask, like, but what does if you are a scientist, you have the right to also have an interest in holisticism, in spirituality, in art. And again, on the flip side, the same applies. If you're looking at something scientifically and rationally, ultimately there comes a point, because the thing is that in human consciousness, as we all know, if we look deep into our own lives, there is a point where you cannot rationalize. And so this applies even for the very scientifically inclined person. There comes a point where you have to allow yourself to look at a story, about molecular particles or something, and that can really help you. You could have spent hours in a lab and you're not able to put your finger on something, and because of the very nature of what it is to be human, just maybe looking at a painting of small bacteria, or I don't know what, it might open up a place in your brain which can provide solutions. But in terms of multiculturalism, how does this apply? And it does, because basically what we have to understand in this world today, that in which we spoke earlier about this kind of interconnectivity that has been laid bare, not only obviously by the technology that we're using these days, but by the virus itself, by the protests, by climate change, all of the big issues affecting the world, even down to the political, the populism, the xenophobia. These are all happening on a global scale. The COVID-19 virus has no regard for national borders. And so what we are being shown, and whether or not we heed and we want to listen to this, but we're being shown in clearer ways than ever, is how interconnected we are. And so I don't think we should move away from the term multiculturalism per se, even if it's maybe not a term that I spend my time advocating for. But this is one of those things of Euro-patriarchal knowledge. It sort of, it makes us forever want to reinvent new terminologies, or dismiss the old ones because we haven't managed to transform the system. But the reason we haven't managed to transform the system is because we haven't really gotten to the deeper message in these concepts that we already have. So we have to become a multicultural society. You can call it whatever you like. I mean, a term that I was drawn to just over a decade ago was Afropolitanism, which is why I called my blog MsAfropolitan. And as the term implies, that was really useful for me because I have an Africa-centered worldview, but I also very much see myself as a citizen of the world. So I'm both Pan-African and cosmopolitan, in the sense of the term cosmopolitan that was used originally by the ancient Greeks to connote a citizen of the world, rather than the kind of modern snobbish, elitist connotation in the term. And so, yes, we just have to, whichever terms we use, basically what I'm trying to say is, the point is that we have to become better at living together as harmoniously as possible. And it is well worth our time to engage with concepts and theories and ideas that can help us to do this, with the broader understanding that, one, we are becoming, we think of ourselves as citizens of our small nations, and our tribes and our this and our that. But really, we have to start to think, what does it mean to be a citizen of the world? What kind of laws do I want to see as a citizen of the world? What kind of technology, what kind of cultural institutions, and how do I want the relationships between the different genders to look like in this global space that we now exist in? So yes, that's where we're headed, I believe.
Thank you very much for these insights. I must admit, I kind of want to go on. I just want to kind of go on. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, there was a slight lag. Thank you. But yeah, I want to go on because I have my own questions to ask, but this is really good, and I will just take a step back and put to your consideration the questions from the audience. We did receive quite a few. I tried to bundle some of them together that had a related theme. So we would have 4 questions from the audience that, if that's right, I will ask separately. The first question I'd like to pose from Nicholas. Do you think that Europeans saw Africa as a natural power that needed controlling like all nature?
I can't hear you very well, Miriam. Sorry, can you repeat the question? I can try to look for it otherwise. My apologies.
Do you think, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm very sorry for these technical.
No problem. It happens.
So yeah, do you think that Europeans saw Africa as a natural power that needed controlling like all nature?
Yes, I mean, to an extent, that definitely informed part of their actions. But I think that, and as I describe in my book, Euro-patriarchal knowledge is really driven by this idea of wanting to acquire and to control nature. So yes, and so I don't think, basically, let's put it this way, because Africa didn't exist at the time that these old Europe patriarchs entered the continent initially. They weren't seeking to control Africa. They were seeking to control nature. And they were seeking to do that in their own sort of personal interest, and to actually to fulfill and reinforce the the narrative of Euro-patriarchal knowledge, even though they didn't call it that, obviously. And so Africa is almost, I mean, this is how it is, you know, it is even more dismissive than we might think it is, because it's actually, you know, Africa was not important in itself. It was what resided in that continent, the nature, but also, yes, the humans as well, eventually, because they saw these opportunities of how they could utilize Africans in, you know, in this process of building Euro-patriarchal empire. Yeah. I hope that answers the question.
I believe it does. It makes me want to read more about this topic. So, yeah, very good introduction. The second question is from Mathieu. How can sensuous knowledge help us heal from the trauma of Euro-patriarchy? If I got the question right.
I mean, this is a question that deserves, you know, a lot of attention in the sense of that it's healing from trauma is something that is, first of all, just so personal, so unique to different individuals, to different groups. But what I suggest, particularly when I write about decolonization, which is a really central concept to this kind of healing work. And what we tend to do when we think about decolonizing is that we it's almost like we see the DE, the prefix, as something that we can just remove, like a piece of furniture that we can just throw out, you know, when we don't want to have it anymore. We don't want Euro-patriarchal knowledge, so we're just going to throw it out. Or even that it's something that we can you know, swallow a pill tonight and wake up tomorrow and we're decolonized, or quote unquote healed. And it doesn't quite work that way. You know, it's a process. And I think that it can be it's dangerous to look at this way, one, because it can make us feel like we're failing very quickly if we don't start to see the effects. It can also reinforce the sense of trauma, because if we feel like things are not moving fast enough, we start to become paranoid, and we can think that, oh, is that other person more decolonized than I am? You know, it becomes a competitive thing. And so in essence, what happens is we are using Euro-patriarchal knowledge to decolonize, which is never going to work. And so if we instead apply sensuous knowledge to this process of healing that is inherent to decolonization, or decolonization that is inherent to healing, what that means is to kind of, it's almost to take a bit of an objective, like a aerial view of the situation. Or as I say in my book, it's a bit like being in a garden. And instead of, you know, trying to chop away poison ivy or anything that you don't like, it's allowing the wilderness in the garden to manifest, and then it's sitting in this garden and observing whatever sort of hybrids are taking place. So maybe different types of plants are synergizing and merging together to shape something new. Maybe there's a completely new type of breed that is growing. You know, it's really this kind of healing is this process of taking a step back, looking at what is happening, and then almost, you know, taking the best of both worlds. Because another thing to say about Euro-patriarchal knowledge is that it's not all bad. You know, and this again, this idea of the good guy and the bad guy is part of Euro-patriarchal knowledge. And in sensuous knowledge, it isn't like that. You know, there's things, Euro-patriarchal knowledge, for instance, is responsible for the Enlightenment, which was a very problematic era in many ways, but it's also a period in human history which made way for things like universities, modern universities anyway, modern hospitals, many institutions that we actually would probably not want to do away with in whatever new world we're trying to create. And so healing, decolonization is, it's important to kind of take what is needed in order to create a society where we can exist in a higher dimension, because I think few would disagree that the state of humanity right now is if we look at it in scales of energy or dimensionality, we're at a low dimension, where we are so not near what I believe the human species has the capacity of being near, together with nature. And so if we want to, if we see ourselves as moving toward a higher dimension of being, in which there is equality, in which there is no hunger, no poverty, these are things that don't need to exist, in which we still have like exciting platforms, we create new technologies, but we use them, for example, in the way that we're using them now due to, now we're being forced to because of the pandemic. But all of these things that can kind of inform a higher dimension of again, you could call it multiculturalism, coexistence, basically, with every life form. Those are the things that we need to carry along. And in that process, there's a tremendous healing in that. We don't tend to think about that, but when you're able to find and identify things that are really working for you, personally or collectively, that really is what healing is.
This just brings me joy. This just brings me joy. Let me move on to the last two questions if we do have time. One is going back to a more cynical place. So one viewer says that there is a hegemonic domination of collective memory in a public sphere that is controlled by monetization of effect and reaction. I'm thinking of social media, marketing and branding, for instance, which capitalizes on our feelings and tries to turn them into, well, greater utility. So in your view, what are the prospects for confronting this industrialized forgetfulness? And I would say this industrialized storytelling that is not to our advantage.
So the question is that we, like the hegemonies that are present even in social media and cultural life, is that the question?
Yes. How do we fight against this? How do we confront this kind of generalized storytelling that is pervasive and all of the... we try to be as genuine as possible and we try to get into this healing process, but all of the tools that we use capitalize on that towards another direction, the one that we don't want to have. And this actually ties back, if this may bring some clarity to, I believe this ties back to a question that was asked also by Nicholas. Are we all being led by a machine that is not in human control anymore, either us or even the ultra-rich? How do we fight to get about this? What is the nature of this hegemonic system and of this hegemony dominant power, and how do we fight against it?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I agree. The beast has grown so big, and it feels inescapable to a great extent. We are now seeing like all of the kind of technological advancements that are being made. But we're also moving toward a world of transhumanism, this kind of the end of death and things like that. In some very privileged parts of the world, which is just shocking when you think about how many people in the world still, how many countries in the global south, especially, where the life expectancy is still below 50. And then you have transhumanist movements in other parts of the world where we're experimenting with nanotechnologies and all kinds of artificial intelligence, and so it feels daunting. It's like, how are we going to fight against these systems? But because of that, it is also precisely because all of these new technologies, this mechanization of society, like we're dealing more and more with computers. So even when you think about, we're using a lot of these platforms positively, you could argue, in many ways, because we're using them right now to come together and to have conversations with audiences that normally might not have access to many of these conversations. So that's very positive. But at the same time, we're also contributing to a culture in which there's less human contact, less soulfulness, less connection, and so we're kind of put in this double bind, this inescapable double bind, and it can be very frustrating. But what sensuous knowledge is about in this kind of instance, when the thought pattern moves into this direction, is all we can really do is to balance. So once we have the clarity and we have sort of, we're awakening to the delusions and the deceptions and the tyranny that is embedded into Euro-patriarchal knowledge and the kinds of systems that it is producing in its current format. So all of these new technologies that were just mentioned. What we then can do is, from this position of growing clarity, and again, it can be almost a bit of an automatic thing, but you start to balance. So you can't escape living in modern society. We all have our smartphones. There's still a lot of inequality in who has access to the internet, but all of us who are here obviously do have access. We're using these systems, so we're empowering them. But we have to, or we ought to, dedicate as much time to sort of working on our connections with each other and with ourselves. So practices like meditation become almost about politics, about survival, because in such a complex world where there is this overflow and abundance of information that is simultaneously contradictory and confusing, we have to, if we're going to affect change, we need to be operating from a grounded and balanced center. And so something like meditation, whichever way one chooses to practice that, it's a very important political tool, actually, to develop a mind that cannot be manipulated, because what Euro-patriarchal knowledge, what these systems are forever trying to do is to manipulate our minds. And so the kind of number one weapon that we're trying to cultivate here is a mind that cannot be manipulated. And this then can lead to, in this balancing act, we're meditating, we're reading, we have to read more books, it's social media, think pieces online. That's not enough to become a dissident of this system. We have to read more books, we have to spend more time with each other, with nature. And then that also can awaken a curiosity and an impetus to create different kinds of platforms. So I'm very interested in what are known as the commons. So the commons traditionally refer to shared land, in which every stakeholder had to do their share to maintain it. And this is something that knowledge also is. Knowledge is a commons. It's something that is it's a shared resource. And so there are growing platforms that are based in this idea. I mean, Wikipedia is a commons, for instance. Everybody can add to it. There are institutional inequalities, of course, like everywhere, but it's an example of a commons. And it isn't until we do the balancing work, the inner, bringing the inner and the outer together, the critical work of exposing and questioning, then we put ourselves in a position where we will just start to connect with people who are engaged with things like the commons. There's other ways of bringing together communities that are trying to create something new. And obviously, the more people that do that is how change happens, which is why it isn't this pill that you take one night and you wake up the next day. It's not going to happen like that. It's going to happen through these kinds of conversations in growing numbers, and people awakening and becoming more lucid to what isn't working, to the holes in the knowledge narrative, and then to committing to building something new.
Actually, I would like to dig a little bit on that, and I very much like the actions that you've listed, but at a very practical level, even more practical than what you've listed now, actually. Could you give some practical examples of what European people, and especially white men, might be able to do to help deconstruct Euro-patriarchy at an everyday level?
What can white men especially do? I'm hesitant to frame the question that way, because this really isn't about singling out white men, unless specific white men feel like they are very much invested in Euro-patriarchal knowledge, which is likely to be the case. I mean, we know most of us have had interactions. Let's put it this way: in our interactions and in our receiving of Euro-patriarchal knowledge, it is likely that it has, in most cases, been perpetuated by the phenotype and the genotype that we call white men. But the reason I'm reluctant to frame my response in that way is because these are constructs, and it is quite possible that a white man can have decolonized and depatriarchalized his mind more than a woman of color. It is possible because what this is about is really this questioning and critiquing and refusing to have to think in fragmented binary ways. But because Euro-patriarchal knowledge privileges and favors white men, I understand your question that it's less likely in some sense. And for those men who want to do something, I think what is most important is to do the work. So we have this culture in our times of people saying that they're allies to something, and it's always something that it amuses me a little bit, because why be an ally when you can just be the damn thing? Just be a feminist, just be a person who is decolonized, just work toward that. Don't work toward becoming an ally. Like, why there's like this extra layer of something. And we've seen that especially now with like Black Lives Matter, and it concerns me, because I don't think that I see that it is well intentioned, but just see that racism it diminishes your own experience too. For instance, if you are protected by a police system, by a law enforcement system, which can do the kind of thing that it did to George Floyd, and that it does, in every European country to people of color, and especially to people of African heritage. If this is a system that protects you. Like, how safe are you really? It might not be doing this to people who look like you, who have the same biology that you do, or whatever it might be, because you could apply this, for instance, to rape and sexual violence against women. But if that is the system that is clearly not protecting, in fact, it is murdering other citizens, then how can you call that a safe system? So, going back, you just, once you see that, once you clearly understand that, then and if you are a person with a modicum of decency and of a kind of virtue, what that does is it automatically makes you opposed to racism, because now it's not only impacting the other, it's actually, you see that it impacts everybody negatively. And so, it's not about becoming an ally to Black people, an ally to women. It's, just changing your mindset. What I need you to do if with these kinds of conversations, if we come together, we're trying to grow together. What the kinds of conversations that are going to get us toward that higher dimension are when people come together with the intention to sort of to see and to consequentially unlearn, and not coming together to sort of tick boxes and pretend that I'm your ally or this or that. Like, we're all in this together, and this is why I've been stressing how this very moment in human history it's really giving us. It's catastrophical, but it's also given us the gift of clarity if we're only willing to see that, because this is hopefully like every event like this is not going to be as catastrophic as this has been, but we definitely are going to continue to see biological threats, potentially biological terrorism, just all kinds of threats to our existence. And so we have to quite rapidly start shifting from a mindset of performativity and all of this that has been very popular in the past decade or so, into a mindset of really grasping how urgently we need to become connected and see that, we all face, as humanity at large, we're all really facing a lot of potential threats from the outside.
I very much like this action plan. I think this is something that we'll be doing. At least DiEM25 will be on the front line. We'll be doing that. And I very much like also the fact that this is really a Black feminist approach for everyone. We're not lying in your title. So
yeah.
Thank you very much for this. Unfortunately, we don't have time to take any more questions, but I thank everyone in the audience for your participation. I thank you, Minna, very, very much for your answers and the delightful talk, which will definitely translate and share so that these insights can be shared with other activist communities throughout Europe. I especially want to thank Hope Carpenter, Nicholas McNair, Rejepi, I'm sorry, for their help. Without them, this would not have been possible. And I want to thank DiEMTV, DiEM UK for their support and for hosting this interview. So to anyone that does not know DiEM25 yet, check out www.diem25.org, register, join the community. We're cool. We want to improve the world in any way that we can. So that's it. I think this is a good way to start a Friday evening. So thank you again, Minna, for your...
Thank you. Thanks, Miriam.
Okay. Have a good night, everyone.